Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face?
Okay, hello everybody. Everybody. What's a wuddy? Um, all right. Anyway, we are here for chapter 6 of the problem of slavery in Western culture. I'm going to try a little experiment here. I've got my blue blocks out. I know they're not called blue blocks anymore, but they were when I bought them, so it still says it on the box. I'm going to give them a try instead of those cheaters to read. They are yellow, so I'm not sure how this is going to work. But let's give it a try. See if this helps. So, here we go. The legitimacy of enslavement and the ideal of the Christian servant. Moral doubts and rationalizations. Having discussed certain conflicts of interest that were potentially conducive to anti-slavery thought, we may now turn to the field of practical ethics and ask how American slavery was actually reconciled with the legal and moral values of Christian civilization. As we have seen in chapters 3 and 4, jurists and theologians could rely on a long tradition of justifying human bondage, and yet there had been a continuing tension between slavery and Christian ideals. To what extent, then, was this tension aggravated by the violent and brutal character of New World bondage? At the time of America's conquest, the Christian view of slavery accommodated a series of balanced dualisms. Slavery was contrary to the ideal realm of nature, but was a necessary part of the world of sin. The bondsman was inwardly free and spiritually equal to his master, but in things external he was a mere chattel. Christians were brothers, whether slave or free, but pagans deserved, in some sense, to be slaves. There was a further division in thought between the troublesome question of the origin and legitimacy of a slaveholder's power and the ideal of a servant in a Christian family where spiritual equality harmonized with outward obedience and authority to provide a model of the fraternal relationship of unequals. Such amiable servitude, originating perhaps in a benign selfdom, could easily be dissociated with the violent act of enslavement. Jurists and theologians might continue to endorse the abstract theory of enslaving prisoners of war, but the crime of man stealing, the universally condemned. To, to make a man a slave always involved the possibility of sin, especially if the act seemed to break the order and balance of nature. But to hold a bond servant was to exercise an ordinance that was part of the governing structure of the world. All right, I'm going to try the others. I think those will be better once I get to gaming. I need to put them on because I don't wear cheaters for gaming. But for the reading part, I think I'm going to have to go with these. A good example of this compromise can be seen in the revised edition of Polydore Virgil's immensely popular De Inventoribus Rerum, which was published in 1521. Polydore described with approval an English custom which gave symbolic recognition to the underlying equality of men, and which resembled the Roman practice of Saturnalia. At Christmas time, it was traditional to elect a servant to preside temporarily over an entire household, but the name servus, he tells us, meant something very different when men were enslaved in war. Quote, "By the grace of God," he concludes, "we are now nearly all brothers in Christ and citizens of the kingdom of God. While we have servants, ministros, in our houses, they are not to be called slaves, servi. Still less should slaves be possessed, though many shamelessly do so." End quote. Polydore wished to dissociate Christian servitude from the barbarous slavery of antiquity, but in 1521 Hernando Cortez was conquering and enslaving Aztecs in Mexico, and Bartolome de las Casas was attempting to establish a utopian colony at Camuna, where Indians and Europeans might live together in harmony. The crucial question then was whether the enslavement of men of different races in a wild and distant land could be made to conform to the Christian ideal of a household where human inequalities were at once sustained and melted away in a hallowed crucible of love. In the present chapter, we shall be concerned with the application of these traditional dualisms to the new problems of American slavery. We shall see that differing conditions in Africa and America favored a double standard in judging the enslavement of Negroes and Indians, and that while a small number of Catholic writers questioned the legitimacy of Negro bondage, their acceptance of traditional assumptions and values narrowed the scope of their criticism and precluded any collective efforts to eradicate the institution. Then in the next chapter, we shall see that Protestants and Catholics shared many assumptions in their attempts to make American servitude compatible with Christian ideals, but that Protestants encountered greater difficulties in reconciling external subordination with their expanded notions of religious liberty. We shall also find that the Protestants' failure to Christianize Negro bondage brought great internal strains in the equilibrium of values which had long given sanction to human slavery. The balanced dualisms of which we have spoken were severely taxed by the enslavement of American Indians. We have already mentioned the inclination of explorers and missionaries to see in the New World the ancient ideal of uncorrupted nature, which might be used as a standard for judging the manners and customs of Europe. Whether pictured as a self-denying Stoic, undistracted from truth by vain desires and superfluities, or as a serenely happy Epicurean, Content with the ripe abundance of the tropical Eden, the Native American appeared to enjoy the innocence and felicity of an era before the fall of man. He at once represented the simple and the exotic, the outlandish custom and the universal virtue. He appealed to the yearning for retirement and repose, and to the desire for a sensuous life uninhibited by clothes, laws, and conventions. Above all, this primeval man was seen to be free from distinctions of rank and wealth, and from the avarice that led Europeans to claim gold and land as their private possessions. If slavery was commensurate with sinful society, and could never touch the inner freedom of man's soul, how could one legitimately enslave these children of paradise, whose external lives seemed to be the spontaneous expression of man's pristine nature? Well, because they kept slaves. In actuality, of course, the American Indian fell short of this idealized image, and even the most fervent missionaries stopped short of Rousseau. Domestic slavery was nearly universal among these supposed free men of the wilderness, who sold bondsmen to one another and eventually to the Europeans. Add the Dominican friars who were reminded by the Indians of Virgil and Horace, or of the simplicity of the primitive church, could not forget that the most philosophical savage was a heathen living in spiritual darkness. Nevertheless, to Christianize natural men did not necessarily require his enslavement. In 1511, Antonio de Montesinos delivered a fiery sermon in Hispaniola in which he denounced the enslaving of Indians as a wicked sin. His language approached the vehemence of later abolitionists, and he was rebuked for his indiscretion by the Dominican superior in Spain. In a calmer spirit, the theologian Matias de Paz argued that Indians could be classed neither with Aristotle's natural slaves nor with the Jews and Saracens who had been exposed to the true faith and had rejected it. But in 1510, John Major concluded that the Native American did meet Aristotle's definition of the natural slave, and many soldiers and administrators were convinced that only coercion could protect the savage from his native idleness and gluttony. Thus the American Indian, as Antonello Gerby has observed, presented Europe with a radically new problem. He did not conform to the traditional antithesis of Christian and infidel, free man and slave, and man and beast. To a people who valued the disciplines necessary for wealth and power, he appeared as a contemptible travesty of human nature, but to a people whose impulse to civilization was balanced by a longing for the simple and spontaneous, he also appeared as the noble vestige of a lost golden age when men's acts and ideals were not separated by the shadow of sin. Prior to 1514, Bartolome de las Casas had worked Indian slaves on his estates in Hispaniola, but in that year he experienced one of those crises of conscience that are so indefinable and yet so common in the history of religion. The lives of many future abolitionists would be transformed by a similar upheaval of soul and change of vision. Henceforth, Las Casas's religious life would be given new meaning and direction by his crusade to protect the Native American from bondage and extermination. As an alternative to the harsh encomienda system, which gave Spanish encomenderos rights to the labor and produce of entire Indian villages, he suggested that Indians and Europeans be settled in model communities that would provide the basis for a peaceful Christianization of the New World. If Christian civilization could not establish such harmonious points of contact with American nature, it would fail in its supreme test. Las Casas did fail in his efforts to plant a utopian colony on the coast of South America, but he later succeeded in his very brief account of the destruction of the Indies, that's a title, in providing Europe with an enduring image of Spanish cruelty and the rape of innocent America. But meanwhile, Las Casas himself had become involved in the more moral ambiguities of America's conquest. Along with his original plan for model Christian communities, he had recommended that forced labor in the mines he confined to Negro slaves who could tolerate such rigorous conditions better than the Indians. About the year 1518, he made his famous proposal to the Spanish crown for replacing Indian laborers with Negroes purchased in Iberia. In his Historia de las Indias, which was not published for more than 300 years, Las Casas said that, quote, not long afterwards, oh, okay, unquote, he discovered that the enslavement of Negroes was apparently as unjust as that of Indians, and he confessed he was not certain whether his ignorance and good intention of liberating the Indians would excuse him from the bar of divine justice. But beyond this brief acknowledgment of guilt, there is no indication that the protector of the Indians publicly condemned the enslavement of Negroes or advocated their emancipation. He apparently owned slaves himself as late as 1544. The changing policies of the Spanish and Portuguese governments revealed a similar double standard with respect to Indians and Negroes, which derived in part from the traditional inclination to associate the Africans with Moors, and thus with a menacing infidelity. Even when Negroes had not been tainted by Islam, they were of the Old World, the world of antiquity, and of the Bible, which at least had been exposed for many centuries to the Word of God. But when Spanish explorers and conquistadors enslaved thousands of helpless Indians, it was difficult to say this was a vindication of the true faith. Hence, in 1537, Pope Paul III declared that the sacraments would be withheld from any colonist who, disregarding the truth that Indians were rational beings capable of Christianity, deprived them of their natural liberty. On various occasions, the rulers of Spain and Portugal forbade the enslavement of Native Americans, even in a supposedly just war. In 1542, the Nuevas Leyes de las Indias ruled that owners who lacked proof of a just title must liberate their Indian slaves. Slaveholders have never taken kindly to moralistic interference, and such laws and edicts provoked colonial insurrections in New Spain, Peru, and New Granada. On various occasions, Brazilian colonists expelled the Jesuits for their activities in favor of Indian workers, and in 1652 the inhabitants of Maranhão revolted when a governor arrived with orders from the King of Portugal to emancipate Indian slaves. Paulo de la Silva Nunes, who represented Maranhão in Lisbon early in the 18th century, argued that Indians were more like beasts than like human beings. Constructing a defense of slavery from biblical and classical sources, he also suggested the possibility that Indians bore the curse of Cain. Such views were common among slaveholding colonists throughout Latin America, where a humane Indian policy continued to be vitiated by stubborn resistance, jurisdictional disputes, and a recognized need for forced labor. But despite the cruelties of the encomienda system, despite the slaving raids into the interior, the separation of families, and the frightful mortality in the mines, Spanish and Portuguese authorities succeeded in liberating thousands of Indian slaves and in preventing the enslavement of thousands more. Over a period of 3 centuries, a vast body of legislation was created to segregate and protect the Native American from the exploitive forces of colonization. Unfortunately, the erosion of Indian slavery simply contributed to the growing demand for Negroes, who were often regarded as a mala raza and who were not protected by a great network of imperial edicts and laws. And some of the leading advocates of the Indian, such as Bishop Landa of Mexico, were the strongest defenders of Negro slavery. This discrimination between the two colored races led quite naturally to the view that Negroes were born to be slaves and were inherently inferior to both Indians and whites. In 1771, for example, the Viceroy of Brazil ordered the degradation of an Indian chief who had, quote, sunk as low as to marry a negress, staining his blood with this alliance, end quote. Okay. It is significant that the first great debate on the legitimacy of American slavery centered almost exclusively on the nature of the Indian, although by 1550, when Las Casas and Sepulveda began their momentous controversy at Valladolid, Negro slavery had been well established in the New World. There are certain interesting parallels, however, between the debates at Valladolid and the debates on the slave trade in the British Parliament some 240 years later. Just as British abolitionists chose to attack the sources of the slave system rather than the system itself, so Las Casas, having been unsuccessful in his attempts to outlaw the encomienda system, had launched a campaign to end the brutal wars which supplied Spanish colonists with Indian slaves. Here he encountered the opposition of the learned Sepulveda, who wrote a treatise blessed by the President of the Council of the Indies, defending the justice of such wars. If the later champions of the slave trade invoked the principles of mercantilism and the climatic theories of Montesquieu, Sepulveda opposed religious zeal with the erudite humanism of the Renaissance. In the 1790s, proponents of the slave trade sought to link the cause of abolition with the heresies of revolutionary France. At Valladolid, Sepulveda portrayed an imaginary debate between a wise Democritus and a harebrained German, Leopoldo, whose pro-Indian views were contaminated with Lutheran errors. However, Sepulveda's principal arguments would later be used to justify the African slave trade. Exploiting the traditional link between sin and slavery, he held that Indians were guilty of idolatry and of sins against nature, and accordingly deserved to be slaves. In contrast to the enlightened Spanish, their minds were barbarous and darkened by vile superstitions. They were, in short, inferior beings who conformed to Aristotle's definition of the natural slave. Their enslavement would promote the spread of Christianity and also protect the weak from being killed or devoured by the strong. Curiously enough, Las Casas accepted the Aristotelian view that some men were slaves by nature, but for Las Casas, the contrast between natural man and civilized man did not suggest a need for harsh repression and discipline. He argued that Indians were equal to the primitive Europeans of antiquity and could thus be considered raw materials for a Christian civilization. In his faith in the potentialities of all rational beings, and in his moral outrage at a brutal violation of human liberty and dignity, Las Casas pointed the way to later abolitionists. Yet his moral vision rested on an assumed dualism between Europe and America, between civilization and innocent nature. Such a dialectic left out the third essential element which Las Casas himself had helped to introduce. Okay. I don't know how long this chapter is. I'm just curious. I'm going to see. I don't know if I should. Because then I start going, oh man, are we ever going to get there? I'm enjoying this read. I really am. But it can be difficult to finish the chapters. Okay. Even Las Casas could not rival Jean-Baptiste de Tertre, a fellow Dominican of the 17th century, in celebrating the natural virtues of the Indian. As a missionary with many years of experience in the French Caribbean, Dutertre had detailed knowledge of the Aborigines' customs and superstitions, which he sometimes saw as the products of sin or at least of religious ignorance. He was also quite frank in admitting that French missionaries had failed dismally in their efforts to Christianize the American heathen. Nevertheless, he strove to invert the image traditionally suggested by the word savage, sauvage, Sauvage, sauvage. The American tropics were not a sterile desert inhabited by barbarous creatures who lacked reason and moral sensibility. In a remarkable passage, he exclaimed, quote, "Therefore, since I have shown the air in the torrid zone to be the purest, the healthiest, and the most temperate of all, and the land to be a kind of miniature paradise, always green and watered by the purest streams, it follows that I must show in this treatise that the natives of these islands are the most contented, the happiest, the least corrupt, the most sociable, the least deceitful, the healthiest of all peoples in the world." Moreover, precisely because the Indians were the products of an uncultivated nature, "all are equal, with hardly any sort of superiority or servitude being known, and one scarcely finds any form of deference such as exists between relatives, for instance, between father and son. No one is richer or poorer than his neighbor." But this paradise soon decayed when touched by European greed and artifice. As early as 1636, Gabriel Sagard had portrayed the corruption of the noble savage in Canada, and the theme would be exploited by numerous Jesuits and Jansenists, partly as a means for enlisting financial support for their missions, which would presumably protect the Indians' innocence by reinforcing it with Christianity. Yet according to Baron de Lohontan, the priests and their religion also contaminated natural man. Europeans were the slaves of irrational custom and prejudice, whereas the American savage had been truly free. But if the Indian represented at once a victim and an equal, what of the Negro? Dutertre summarized the difference when he repeated with apparent approval a proverb of the French West Indies. Quote, "To look askance at an Indian is to beat him is to kill him, to beat a Negro is to nourish him." End quote. The Dominican's admiration and sympathy for the noble savage did not extend to the Negro, whom he regarded with that curious mixture of inconsistent attitudes that were to become so characteristic of American slaveholders. He admitted that most Negro slaves had been captured in war, and that some, including princes and queens, had been kidnapped or unjustly seized, and yet he observed, without either protesting or stating his own views, that Negroes in the West Indies conformed to Aristotle's definition of a slave as the instrument of his master, that they were treated like animals as if the blackness of their skin were a mark of their misfortune, and that if physical labor was the penalty of man's rebellion against God, the most severe form of this punishment had been inflicted upon the Africans. Dutertre did not say that Negroes should be regarded as mere instruments or animals, or that their sin was proportionate to their suffering. On this subject, at least, he adopted the mantle of the objective historian, and announced that he would avoid the knotty question of slavery's ultimate legality, and yet he wanted to vindicate the colonists' reputation, which had been unjustly damaged by pious but ignorant men who had assumed that the laws protecting human liberty in France could be applied to all parts of the world. Dutertre assured his readers that Negro slaves, when well fed and gently treated, were the happiest people in the world. Charles de Roquefort, who had also been in the West Indies and whom Duterte accused of plagiarism, was confident that Negroes preferred a kind European master to their original liberty in Africa. But the Indian, they agreed, could never reconcile himself to bondage, and haughtily refused to associate in any way with the Negro. Unlike the complacent African, the American savage was quick to defend the honor of his women. Unless treated with respect, he often languished and died from a profound melancholy. These were the elements for the later stereotypes of the proud, freedom-loving Indian and the humble Negro who was born for slavery. But in neither Duterte nor de Roquefort is the contrast so complete and so free of ambiguities. Both emphasize the necessity of governing Negroes with firmness and strict discipline. Basically, arrogant and untrustworthy, the African would exploit the slightest weakness or leniency of his master, and unless kept in due submission, would rise in armed revolt. Excessive severity might also provoke insurrection, but only the constant fear of punishment would induce slaves to labor in the fields under a hot sun. Hence the dualism of Indian and African was matched by a divided image of Negro slavery itself. One has the impression that these missionaries wanted to think of the Negro as a natural servant. Sorry, I totally lost my place. One has the impression that these missionaries wanted to think of the Negro as a natural servant who could find true happiness only in loyalty and obedience to a kindly Christian master. But the picture they presented was one of fear, violent brutality, and unrelieved drudgery for the benefit of a class whose sole interest lay in the rapid accumulation of wealth. Okay, I am going to stand up. 20 pages to go, or, well, 19. In spite of a widespread tendency to differentiate the Negro from the Indian and to associate the latter with the freedom of nature, Negro slavery was in actuality imposed on top of pre-existing Indian slavery. In North America, at least, the two never diverged as distinct institutions. Nevertheless, the practical circumstances of colonial settlement afforded the Indians some protection. From Canada to South America, colonists took the enslavement of hostile savages as a matter of course, but they knew that their trade and sometimes their very survival depended on alliances with friendly tribes. During the Pequot War and King Philip's War, New Englanders shipped captured Indians to Bermuda and the West Indies, and at other times used the same punishment as a means of disciplining neighboring tribes. But this meant that quote-unquote praying Indians and those who cooperated with the colonists were usually exempt from the danger of enslavement. A few colonists, such as John Eliot and Roger Williams, who had established intimate relations with the natives, were willing to question the wisdom of justice of condemning even hostile savages to perpetual bondage. In Virginia, on the other hand, Nathaniel Bacon bitterly attacked Governor Berkeley's policy of protecting friendly tribes, and in 1676 the rebel leader secured a law authorizing the enslavement of all Indians captured in war. But notwithstanding Bacon's success in arousing racial hatred and in plundering and enslaving friendly tribes, Virginians tended to make a sharp distinction between domestic allies and foreign enemies. Yet to the purchaser of Negroes there was no political difference between Bendigo and Dahomean. Removed from the sources of African slavery, he was concerned with tribal origin only as an indication of probable character and stamina. While North American colonists continued to hold Indian slaves through the 18th century, they at least assumed that the majority of Indians were rightfully free and that every bondsman was a legitimate captive, or the descendant of such a captive. They were also alert to the dangers of antagonizing neighboring tribes or of filling their communities with enemy warriors who might easily escape to the nearby forests. As a consequence, colonial legislation gradually revealed a double standard toward Indians and Negroes, which was analogous to the distinction made by Spanish law and by such writers as Las Casas and Duterte. For reasons of expediency, a number of colonies flatly prohibited the importation of Indian slaves. From 1712 to 1714, this was done by Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. In order to stop the influx of large numbers of captives taken in the Tuscarora War in Carolina, fearing that the shipment of Indian slaves from the continent was detrimental to other commerce, Jamaica passed a law in 1741 which forbade all future purchases of imported Indians, and which granted liberty to those brought illegally into the island. The law did not affect Indians already in the colony, but it is significant that an attempt was made to outlaw the Indian slave trade at a time when Negroes were demanded in ever increasing numbers. Although the British and French colonies gave the same legal status to Indian and Negro slaves, they showed a marked tendency by the 18th century to restrict the bondage of Indians to certain tribes. In South Carolina, Indian slavery was closely linked with the Western fur trade, and in the struggle with France and Spain for control of the Southwest, the institution became an important weapon for securing alliances and punishing enemies. Carolina traders had no scruples about buying Indians from the coureurs de bois at the mouth of the Mississippi and selling them ultimately in the West Indies. But the proprietors of the colony always promised protection to their Indian allies, and after 1740 the courts of South Carolina held that the color of an Indian, unlike that of a Negro, was not evidence of prima facie evidence of slavery, since it could not be presumed that any given Indian or his ancestors had been legitimately captured in war. The distinction would appear to have been an outgrowth of the practical demands of trade and diplomacy. The French Canadians adopted a somewhat similar policy. From the late 17th century, the settlements in the St. Lawrence Valley had provided a regular market for Pawnee slaves who were captured in the West by other Indians and eventually sold to the French. But a law of 1709 called Panis and Negroes were legally classed as slaves, and in 1760 in the Treaty of Montreal, England formally recognized the legitimacy of Negro and Pawnee slavery in Canada. If it was extraordinary to single out a particular Western tribe for enslavement, it is all the more significant that the French called the Pawnees, quote unquote, the Negroes of America. Like the Africans, the Pawnees came from an area so remote that one could ignore the mode and justice of their enslavement, and as Governor La Jonquière ruled with respect to Negroes who escaped to Canada from the British colonies, tout nègre est esclave quelque part. I'm butchering it. I'm not even going to bother continuing. But since the Ordinance of 1709 confined slavery to these two groups, the question soon arose whether other Indians could legitimately be held as slaves. It was the judgment of Louis XV that the matter could be determined by the established usage of the colony, which gave full rights of French citizenship to converted Indians, with the exception of the unfortunate Pawnees. Although Indians from various western tribes were sometimes classed as Pawnees, which justified their being held as slaves, the French colonists had no wish to jeopardize vital commercial relationships with enslaving Indians from the lake and forest or by enslaving Indians from the lake and forest regions. They did seize or purchase a number of Eskimos, but Eskimos proved to be very poor slaves. Pause, sip, hydrate. Okay, that was very poor slaves. Okay, the ambiguities of Indian bondage were especially evident in Virginia. An act of 1670 stated that, quote, all servants not being Christians imported into this colony by shipping shall be slaves for their lives, but what shall come by land shall serve, if boys or girls, until 30 years of age, if men or women 12 years and no longer, end quote. This law has sometimes been interpreted simply as a step toward differentiating Indians from Negroes. But since Indian slaves were occasionally imported by sea, the fundamental distinction would seem to have been between heathen from distant areas and those from the surrounding country. This distinction was soon effaced by a number of statutes, most notably by an act of 1682 that put Indians and Negroes on the same footing and authorized the purchase of slaves captured or otherwise acquired by neighboring tribes. A law of 1691 was promoting free trade with Indians apparently withdrew the right to purchase slaves, and in 1705, when part of the law of 1682 was reenacted, Indians were specifically omitted from the class of imported servants who were judged to be slaves. Indian bondage persisted in Virginia, but the institution brought increasing confusion and litigation. By the mid-18th century, virtually all Indians were free, while the vast majority of Negroes were slaves. The final resolution came in 1806 with the crucial case of Hudgens versus Wrights, which involved the nearly white descendants of an Indian slave. Drawing on the doctrine of natural liberty embodied in the Virginia Bill of Rights, Chancellor George Wythe held that whenever one person claimed to hold another in bondage, the onus probandi lay with the claimant. St. George Tucker, alarmed by the construction that would apply with equal force to Negroes and Indians, argued that the Bill of Rights, quote, was notoriously framed with a cautious eye to this subject and was meant to embrace the case of free citizens or aliens only, and not by a side wind to overturn the rights of property, end quote. Basing his position on historical precedent rather than abstract principle, Tucker first appealed to an earlier decision that had accorded freedom to all Indians and their descendants who had entered Virginia after 1705, and then noted that the decisive date should be pushed back to 1691, when the importation of Indian slaves had in effect been made illegal. The final decree of the Supreme Court of the state concurred with Chancellor Wythe's principles only so far as they related to white persons and American Indians, quote, but entirely disapproving thereof so far as the same relates to native Africans and their descendants, end quote. After a slow and confused development, the distinction between Indian and Negro was now clear-cut. Only the aborigine who had been pictured by Dutertre and Lohanton as the innocent child of nature could share the Virginians' natural rights and liberties. Although Indians and Negroes were both cruelly exploited and often reduced to the same status as chattel slaves, it is undeniable that the European conscience was more troubled by the plight of the Native American. We have suggested that this moral sensitivity toward the Indian was the product of an interaction between the conditions of American settlement and certain traditional views of human bondage. On the level of expediency, colonists were reluctant to seize neighboring savages who provided them with markets and produce, and since it was hardly possible in America to dissociate even the mildest Indian servitude from the violence of enslavement, judges and missionaries were sensitive to the traditional opposition between natural liberty and an act of force that could be justified only by tangible proof of the victim's crime. It was otherwise in Africa. Because Negroes lived for the most part in populous and highly organized societies, they were able to deal on nearly equal terms with the early Portuguese traders who respected both the wealth and power of their kings. There was little reason to associate the African with a primitive or uncorrupted nature. He was known from the Bible and from the writers of antiquity, and he often bore the influence of Moslem culture. Yes, he's spelling it with an O, so that's why I'm pronouncing it that way. Okay, and I am okay. I'll get into that at the end. It was sometimes said that he had once been exposed to the true faith, but had either rejected or forgotten it. He was in any event too advanced in culture to be styled as an innocent savage, dispossessed of his land and freedom by the avaricious European. He was not overwhelmed by armies or by a mass of colonists spreading through his country. His contact with Europeans was confined to small groups of professional traders who clustered in vulnerable forts along the coast and who were subject to the rules and restrictions of a well-developed commercial system. When the chieftain of semi-feudalistic society sold bondsmen to a Portuguese trader, he merely followed a practice long established among his own people and further stimulated by Arab merchants. He could not foresee that the settlement of America would revolutionize the character of this trade, or that its evil consequences would be obscured by the apparent power and independence of his people. The most gradual changes are often the most destructive. If Europe and Africa began their ill-fated relationship as near equals, the influx of European goods, particularly of firearms, slowly disrupted the equilibrium of West African cultures. To Europe, improved technology brought power and wealth, but to Africa it brought only more efficient means to capture slaves for the American market. The religious and political power structure of West African states was peculiarly susceptible to the corrosive effects of the slave system. In the Niger Delta, where priests had traditionally imposed heavy fines on men who offended an oracle, it was relatively easy to discover an increasing number of offenses which could be expiated only by a payment in slaves, who could then be sold profitably to European traders. Believing in divine kinship and divine kingship and divided by intense religious loyalties, the forest peoples of Guinea looked upon one another as contemptible heretics who deserved death or slavery. Accordingly, their religious wars were well adapted for procuring captives who could be exchanged for guns. And since the tribes which captured the most slaves received the most European goods, and were thus best equipped in the struggle for survival, it was only natural that certain groups in the interior, such as the Ashantis and the Dahomians, should rise to power as specialists in the art of enslaving. Initially cut off from the Europeans by coastal tribes who were able to act as middlemen, these forest kingdoms eventually pushed toward the sea, extending the zone of terror as their power increased. Hence, in 1727, John Atkins complained that the triumph of Dahomey had destroyed the orderly pattern of the slave trade. The Negro who sold you slaves on one day might be sold himself a few days later, and the chaos brought by the emergence of specialized slaving states was matched on the side of the Europeans by the arrival of independent traders who looked only for quick profit. Unrestrained by the long-term interests of the major companies, these merchants cared little how slaves were acquired and did not scruple at kidnapping or inciting raids on peaceful villages. In general, however, the system was so institutionalized that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement. As late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior and to discover whether there was any source besides, quote, that of being taken prisoners in wartime, end quote. William Smith showed the dependence of traders on African conditions when he blamed the relative absence of native quarrels for the shortage of slaves along the Kwakwa and the Grain coasts. Some traders knew that defaulting debtors and tribesmen guilty of the slightest offenses were sold as slaves, and that kings sent troops at night to raid distant villages, where defenseless men and women were gagged and bound, and infants were thrown in sacks. But this knowledge was usually vague, and since it was only known that Negroes often sacrificed their victims, a European might plausibly conclude that his sole influence in Africa was to spare lives. In the mid-15th century, Gomez Yanes de Azorara was an eyewitness to a Portuguese slaving raid and to the subsequent sale of the captives. He was deeply moved by the spectacle of human beings killing themselves to avoid capture, by the brutal separation of families, by the whipping of mothers who futilely clung to their husbands or children. He could not keep from weeping in spite of his realization that these pagans deserved to be slaves, and he prayed that God might excuse his tears. His response of sympathy, as opposed to his belief that Christianization justified inhumanity, was the reaction of a normal man of any age. Even the slave ship captains of later centuries were not immune to such feelings, although their sensitivity was blunted by a system that fostered rationalization. Jean Barbeau felt that the slave trade should be conducted according to the Golden Rule. Europeans should treat Negroes as they themselves would be treated if they had the misfortune of being captured by Algerians. The same parallel suggested a different answer to the Quakers of Germantown in 1688. Barbeau congratulated himself on his own humanity, when by accident he bought members of a family who had been separated when enslaved. He was so touched by their joy at reuniting that he ordered his sailors to treat them better than usual, and he sacrificed profit by selling them to a single buyer in Martinique. He described the Middle Passage on his own ship as a virtual pleasure cruise, with happy Negroes smoking pipes on deck and dancing and singing through the evenings. That many slaves attempted suicide or refused to eat he attributed to their childish fear of being devoured by European cannibals. Barbeau said that since he was a naturally compassionate man and could not let them starve, he found it necessary to smash out their teeth and feed them by force. William Snelgrave gave his slaves an orientation program before departure, assuring them that they would not be eaten and describing to them the joys of plantation life in the West Indies. But despite this, and despite his idyllic picture of the Middle Passage, he admitted that his slaves had frequently mutinied. Thomas Phillips, who was also disheartened by slaves refusing to eat and jumping overboard, confessed that he was too humane to cut off the arms and legs of a few Negroes, as some captains had done, to terrify the rest. As a good Christian, he had no doubt that Negroes were as dear to God as white men, but as a practical man he knew that when slaves were fed on board, his men must stand by with loaded guns and lighted matches. In various ways the traders and captains attempted to make the best of their grim business. The agents of the Royal African Company were not supposed to buy Negroes who had been kidnapped, and when in doubt they were to consult the native alcalde. Francis Moore, who was a factor of the company, told of freeing a man who had been enslaved for stealing a pipe, although the owner of the pipe had frowned upon such charity. The traders associated with the large companies were unanimous in condemning the cruelty and treachery of the independent merchants. They also knew that regular profits depended on cultivating the goodwill of certain tribes, on providing for speedy and efficient transactions, and on keeping their ships as clean and orderly as possible. But this increasing preoccupation with perfecting the details of the system obscured the central problem of what slavery meant for Africa. For most Europeans, it was sufficient to know that merchants bought Negroes who had been condemned to slavery by the laws of their own country, and that these bondsmen would lead safer and happier lives in the Christian communities in the New World. At a time when Englishmen considered it humane to ship chained convicts to America under conditions that approximated those of the African trade, few men could appreciate the point made by the publisher Thomas Astley in commenting on Snellgrave's argument that Negroes benefited from American slavery. If this was so, said Astley, it should be left to the Negroes to make the choice. I have heard that argument as well, that um, slaves brought to America, um, at least the first generation, may not have been better off, but all of their progeny are. From a certain point of view, I suppose you could say that. I'm not sure I totally agree, but I do see where they're coming from. Um, okay. The remoteness of Africa and the fact that captives were generally derived from the forest regions behind the coast made it easier to dissociate Negro servitude from the violent act of enslavement, and because the dark continent defied penetration, Europeans pictured it as a hostile world of disease, dangerous animals, and formidable warriors. Until the 18th century, the image of Africa was sharply differentiated from that of peaceful, unspoiled America. If it was a crime, as many writers asserted, to deprive Native Americans of their natural liberty, it was actually an act of liberation to remove Negroes from their harsh world of sin and dark superstition. Thus, the very conditions of the African trade reinforced the more repressive side of the traditional dualisms regarding slavery. The ideal of the happy servant in a Christian society justified a trade that was vital to the economies of Europe and America. Quote, though the odious appellation of slaves is annexed to this trade, wrote a leading economist, they are certainly treated with great lenity and humanity, and as the improvement of the planters' estates depends upon due care being taken of their health and lives, I cannot but think their condition is much bettered to what it was in their own country. End quote. And that's the argument I was talking about. They're saying it was so rough and disease ridden and so on and backward that they were better off here, or at least their um, offspring and their future generations would be better off. Um, I can't, again, I can't say I totally agree, but I see where they're coming from. Uh, Look at how spoiled all Americans are now. Spoiled and entitled. Um, and that's where I disagree. Maybe they're not better off. But the plantation was more easily idealized than the African slave market. If for some 2 centuries no Las Casas actively fought for the Negro's liberty and no Duterte celebrated his virtues, there were at least a few men who questioned the legitimacy of the African trade. As we have seen, servitude had long been a source of tension in Christian thought, and there was no lack of precedent for censuring the purchase of men who had been reduced to bondage without just provocation. Such protest would require considerable independence of mind, since the Portuguese slave posts were closely connected with missionary establishments, and criticism of the African trade might challenge the very ideal of spreading the faith. Nevertheless, by the mid-16th century, Fray Domingo de Soto, who was a friend of Las Casas, took note of rumors that Negroes were being seized by illicit means. While there would be nothing wrong, he said, with buying men who sold themselves into slavery, one could not in good conscience keep a man who had been born free and enslaved by fraud or violence, even if he had been purchased in good faith. De Soto doubted whether there was any justice in Negro slavery. In 1571, the question was explored more fully by a noted Sevillian theologian, Tomás de Mercado, whose Summa de Tratos y Contratos provided a critical scrutiny of the disruptive effects of American colonization on prices, contracts, and business ethics. Mercado's remarks on slavery have sometimes been quoted out of context, and it is important to realize that he worked from thoroughly conventional premises. He recognized the authority of the King of Portugal on the coast of Africa. He assumed the legality of slavery as an institution, accepting the traditional grounds of war, crime, and self-sale. Though he considered Africans barbarians who committed enormous and detestable crimes, he accepted the justice of their laws, condemning offenders to perpetual bondage. Divided into petty states with little sense of order or obligation to a sovereign, the Negroes also engaged in continual warfare and hence took many captives, and this was justified by the law of nations, even if the merciful influence of Christianity had led Europeans to ransom prisoners of their own faith. Mercado appeared somewhat more doubtful than when he turned to the right of African parents to sell their own children. But while the practice had been prohibited in ancient Greece and Rome and was obviously subject to perversion, it derived ultimately from paternal authority, and its legality could not be questioned. If Negro slavery had rested only on these foundations, Mercado would presumably have had no objections. He found, however, that a large number of slaves were being obtained by trickery, force, and robbery. Because the Africans were wild savages, their actions were governed by passion rather than reason. The Portuguese and Spanish offered such high prices for slaves that the Negroes hunted each other like deer, raiding villages and kidnapping unprotected persons, even when they lacked the excuse of war. Incited by greed, princes and judges condemned their rivals and convicted countless others on trumped-up charges. Fathers sold their children out of spite or for the slightest disobedience. Mercado went on to describe the cruelty and oppression of the slave ships, where the smell alone was sufficient to kill a large number of the captives. Only recently, he charged, a ship had left Cape Verde bound for New Spain with 500 slaves, jammed under the deck like hogs. 120 had died the first night. Only 200 had survived the voyage. Mercado anticipated 18th century abolitionists in his conclusions as well as in his descriptions of slaving raids and the Middle Passage, while emphasizing that buying and selling Negroes was not in itself illegal. He asserted that the facts of the situation made it impossible to engage in the African trade without incurring deadly sin. A buyer of any commodity was guilty of sin if he had reason to suspect that the commodity was stolen property or that the seller lacked a legal title. And since it was common knowledge that a large proportion of Negroes had been obtained unlawfully, no one could enter into commerce with a clear conscience. Mercado considered the possibility of having royal officers oversee the marketing of slaves and require all traders to prove the legality of their transactions, but he rejected this as infeasible. The inspection would become a meaningless formality. American colonists had already shown how the will of kings could be defied or misconstrued. Mercado feared that it was impossible to remedy the Negro's plight, though he observed that profits from the slave trade were uncertain and of short duration, which is a sign of divine displeasure. With respect to the Negro trade in Seville, he suggested that each man consult his confessor. Okay, 196, and I'm on 189. Whew. These are long chapters. An even more radical attack on Negro slavery appeared in 1573 from the hand of Bartolomé de Albornoz, who had become a professor of law at the University of Mexico at the time of its founding, and who had later been called to study at Talavera. Like Mercado, Albornoz challenged both the methods by which Africans were captured and the legality of their subsequent sale. He went beyond the theologian, however, in his contempt for sophistry and rationalization. In the ironic tone of a philosophe, Albornoz said that purchase of Negroes from the Portuguese must be in conformity with both statute law and the law of conscience. Since it was accepted by kings and public opinion, no member of the religious order had spoken out against the trade, and indeed the clergy were as active as other people in buying and selling slaves. Commenting on Mercado's theoretical justification for slavery, Albornoz thought the reasons must be good since he could not understand them. But when he became serious, he found the arguments which had satisfied Mercado even less convincing than those that the theologian had rejected. Even Aristotle had not stated that prisoners of war should be enslaved, and certainly such a practice was not sanctioned by the law of Christ. How could a purchaser possibly know whether a bondsman had been justly captured? What of women and children who could not be guilty of aggression? By natural law, the presumption was always in favor of liberty, and men were obligated to help the victims of oppression rather than becoming accomplices in the oppressive acts. Yet it was commonly said that Negroes were better off in Christian land, even as slaves, than in living like beasts in Africa. Albornoz approached this argument with the cautious skepticism. He suggested that the European might not be the proper one to determine such a matter, and in any event, improving the welfare of the Negro hardly sanctioned injustice. Judas had won no benefit from the good his evil act produced. No one had proved that Africans must lose their natural liberty in order to become Christians. Did the law of Christ state that liberty of the soul must be paid for by slavery of the body? The truth was that the clergy were too fond of their comforts to go to Africa to bear the cross and to work for genuine conversions. Albornoz knew these remarks would be condemned by many, but for his own benefit and out of love of his fellow beings, he felt the duty of warning merchants that there were better things than this bloodthirsty trade in which to invest their wealth. While Bartolomé de Albornoz did not demand a general emancipation of slaves, he had the outlook of a genuine abolitionist. It would appear that no one else attacked Negro slavery with such uncompromising boldness until the late 17th century, and one may note that Albornoz's book, which is now exceedingly rare, was placed upon the index. Hello, Nambro. How are you tonight? We are coming up just a few pages from the end of the book, not the book, the chapter. Um, we're on page 191 and it ends on page 196. So we got a few to go. But the issue of legitimacy had previously brought conflicts of conscience to the western side of the Atlantic. When the Jesuit Miguel Garcia arrived in Brazil in the 1580s, he was shocked to discover that even his order's college at Bahia owned Negroes who had been illicitly enslaved. Repudiating the usual rationalizations, he went so far as to refuse to hear confession from anyone involved in the injustice of slaveholding. Garcia was clearly a disrupting influence, and he soon encountered the indignant opposition of men who knew their position was not quite morally secure. Neither he nor Gansola Liete, and the first professor of arts in Brazil, could stomach a country that claimed its survival depended on necessary injustice, and both returned to Europe. Perhaps the first, but certainly not the last, of such emigres from an American slave society. More typical was the great Jesuit pioneer Manuel de Nobrega, who, upon arriving in Bahia in 1549, courageously denounced the settlers for their mistreatment of the Indians, and whose subsequent pleas to the Board of Conscience in Lisbon helped to bring laws prohibiting the enslavement of Indians except in wars authorized by the king or governor. Almost immediately after his arrival in Brazil, Nobrega unhesitatingly accepted the necessity of Negro slavery for both the colony and his own order. In a letter of 1557 to a Jesuit official in Portugal, he spoke of the need for more Negroes to maintain his religious establishment, after referring to the death of some slaves who had been contributed by the king. Miguel Garcia publicly disputed Nobrega's view that the legality of Negro slavery had been carefully weighed in the consciences of the people, but in 1583, when the question was referred to the body of European jurists and moralists, it was Nobrega's view that won assent. Seraphim Liete, the modern authority on the Jesuits in Brazil, has argued that it is unhistorical to blame Nobrega or other Jesuits for not acting like 19th century abolitionists. To accuse them of injustice for favoring the Indians, Liete says, is like condemning a man for founding a hospital for tuberculosis while ignoring the victims of leprosy. But even if one agrees with Liete that the alternatives were to condemn slavery and hence to denounce all efforts at colonization, or to accept slavery as Nobrega did, in the hope that it might be mitigated by Christianity, one is bothered by the thought that the most respected and morally influential men lent their voices so easily to endorse what was most profitable. This is all the more perplexing in light of the moral courage of men like Antonio Vieri, Vieira, I'm going to say Vieira, who carried on in the 17th century the reforming spirit of Montesinos and Las Casas. Vieira bravely fought for the rights of Indians in Brazil and argued his case in the courts of Lisbon and Rome. In 1640, when the Portuguese in Brazil were hard pressed by the Dutch, Vieira preached a Jeremiad sermon which developed the classic theme of the colonists' betrayal of their original high purpose and of the need for reform and purification. The source of Brazil's evils, Vieira said, was the same sin that had corrupted mankind. Just as Adam had taken something to which he had no right, so the covetous Brazilians had disregarded justice and had seized the possessions of others. The great Jesuit was more explicit in a flaming sermon delivered upon his arrival in Maranhão in 1653, after he had enjoyed a period of political influence in Portugal. Comparing the past calamities of war, disease, and famine to the punishments of the Pharaoh for refusing to release the Israelites, Vieira approached the vehemence of the radical abolitionist. Quote, Every man who holds another unjustly in servitude, being able to release him, is certainly in a state of condemnation. All men are almost all men in Maranham hold others unjustly in servitude. All therefore are almost all are in the state of condemnation. End quote. In former times the devil had to offer all the kingdoms of earth to purchase a single soul, but in Maranhão the price had been reduced. Quote, a negro for a soul, and the soul the blacker of the two. This negro shall be your slave for the few days that you may have to live, and your soul shall be my slave through all eternity. End quote. The denunciatory spirit, the device of projecting the blackness of the negro on the soul of the slaveholder, the image of slavery as the original sin destroying America's innocence and mission, all these anticipate the abolitionist frame of mind and suggest that its components were not dependent on evangelical Protestantism, but through Vieira, that though Vieira drew on the Hebraic themes of deliverance and communal guilt, he also accepted the Stoic and early Christian view that slaves, while free in soul and equal before God, should acquiesce in their external fate. Vieira did not acquiesce himself in the fate of the Indians, for though he admitted that Brazil could not exist without their forced labor, he boldly opposed the interests of the colonists in his crusade for protective legislation. By winning for the Jesuits a relatively free hand in Indian affairs, he did much to limit and regulate the future enslavement of aborigines. But these efforts did not extend to the African. Vieira told African Vieira told Negro slaves that he knew of their wounds and scourgings, their hunger and fatigue and revilings, but if they endured these sufferings, with patience, following the example of the blessed Redeemer, they would have the merit as well as the torment of martyrdom. Their bondage might become a new Calvary, but they must not, merely because their labor was hard, shirk their duty. Almost 2 centuries later, an Episcopal bishop would give the same comforting message to Negroes in Virginia. The fact that the clergy in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies owned thousands of slaves was proof, according to the Council of the Indies, that the African trade was legitimate. This religious sanction was crucial in 1685 when the Council of the Inquisition opposed the grant of the Spanish asiento to a Dutch heretic, Balthazar Coymans. The slave trade had traditionally been justified by the argument that it promoted the spread of Catholic Christianity. It was for this reason that Moslem slaves had been barred from the Spanish colonies. The Council of the Inquisition feared that Negroes would now be contaminated with Dutch Protestantism and would spread the disease through Spanish America. This objection led Charles II to order a full-scale investigation of the African trade. The campaign against Balthazar Coymans succeeded in raising as a byproduct certain questions regarding the legitimacy of African enslavement. It was at this time that the Council of the Indies appealed to the earlier opinions of Molina, Sanchez, and Sandoval, as well as to classical authorities. In addition to being infidels, the Negroes were, according to some of the pro-slavery theorists, born and predestined for bondage, and conformed to Aristotle's conception of the natural slave. And even if the origins of Negro servitude were not strictly legitimate, the Council of the Indies held that the slave trade could not be stopped without endangering the survival of the colonies and hence the propagation of the true faith. All the devices of casuistry were employed to show that the souls of Negroes might safely survive a transatlantic voyage with a heretic captain. Ultimately, Coymans agreed to equip his ships with Capuchin monks. The most serious examination of the legitimacy and expediency of the slave trade resulted in its thorough vindication. I finally quit drinking for good. Now I drink for evil. That's right. In the Catholic colonies, what concern there was for the Negro was largely channeled toward the salvation of his soul. His greatest champions were men like San Pedro Claver, who met the slave ships when they arrived in Cartagena, who baptized the occupants as they disembarked, and who sought to ease their sufferings with acts of kindness and charity. But though Claver was a dedicated, saintly man and called himself, quote, the slave of the Negroes, end quote, he did not develop the anti-slavery arguments that had been outlined by Mercado and Albornoz. The rare individuals who did revive the early doubts on the legitimacy of African enslavement were held in disrepute and even banished from the colonies. As late as 1794, for example, the Capuchin friar Jose de Bolena was expelled from Bahia for maintaining that the buyers of slaves were responsible for determining the legitimacy of title, and for arguing that because this was not done, the African trade was unlawful. The governor discovered that Bologna had acquired his radical ideas from some Italian priests who were also ordered to leave the province. Much earlier, in 1758, Manuel Ribeiro Roca uh, had published a discourse on slavery after returning to Lisbon from Bahia. Instead of challenging the legality of slavery as an institution, Roca had focused his attention on the sadistic cruelties which Brazilian masters inflicted upon their slaves. Affirming that Negroes should be treated as brothers in Christ, Roca recommended that they be permitted to have families, be given adequate food and religious instruction, and be prepared for eventual freedom. But this modest proposal was regarded as highly subversive. When the anti-slavery spirit finally began to emerge in Brazil early in the 19th century, it was not nourished by a continuing tradition of protest. The first anti-slavery leaders were not inspired by such isolated figures from the past as Sandoval, Roca, and Bologna, but by the ideas of the Enlightenment and the example of British reformers. And that is the end of this chapter. Another very good read. Um, and I don't feel like I struggled quite as much with that one. Um, Interesting. He mentions very briefly a couple of times that the Indians, I know he's saying Native Americans, I say Indians, and for good reason. If you want to know why, I'll get into it, but you'll have to ask. He did mention that they kept slaves, at least some of them. And I'm glad that he does, but I wish he would have been a little bit more explicit about that, because a lot of people still have this idea of the noble savage that was just so perfect and so innocent and and they never did anything wrong, and they were just here in the Americas living their lives in perfect peace and harmony, when in fact they were at war and they were raping and pillaging and murdering and enslaving each other for thousands of years before any white man ever set foot here. But he did at least mention it. So that's at least a good thing. And maybe he'll get into it more later on. Um, and he hinted at the fact that there were free black people that owned black slaves. He hinted at it. He didn't come out and say it. But yeah, I'm really interested to see if he expands on a couple of those things later on. But that's it for now. I I doubt I'll be able to stream tomorrow night. I know I won't be able to stream through next Wednesday. So Thursday next will be most likely my next stream, except for a gaming stream that's coming up here in a few minutes. So I will try to get everything transferred over to YouTube between now and when I leave town for the holiday. And everybody have a good 4th of July if you're in the U.S. And if you're not, have a good 4th of July. It's just not your Independence Day. So I will see anybody that's coming back for in a few minutes for probably the final episode of Oblivion, because I think I'm in the last battle. So yeah, see you in a few minutes.
Prepare to die.